Good morning here in the US on the East Coast and a very early morning on the US West Coast. Good afternoon in Europe and good evening in China and a very late evening in Australia and in New Zealand and in Asia. My name is Olgierda Furmanek, and together with Professor Xuanmin Luo from Guangxi University, I am co-chairing this 9th Asian Pacific Forum on Translation and Intercultural Studies. I'm a professor of Spanish and the director of Interpreting and Translation graduate program here at Wake Forest University. My research focus is interpreting studies and teaching of interpreting. I teach interpreting and translation as well as courses in applied interpreting studies and methodology of teaching interpreting at the graduate and undergraduate level. For us here at Wake Forest, it is an honor and a great pleasure to host the 9th Asian Pacific Forum on Translation and Intercultural Studies jointly with Guangxi University and Tsinghua University. Wake Forest is located in the beautiful hills of western North Carolina in the Piedmont of the Appalachian Mountains, just 2 hours from the range of the oldest mountains in the US, with peaks up to 2,000 meters. And we are also just 4 hours drive away from the Atlantic coast, the Cape Hatteras region, at the beautiful dunes where Brothers Wright successfully tried their first flight. They made the first controlled flight sustained of a powered heavier-than-air aircraft in 1903, actually in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And hence North Carolina motto is first in flight. Wake Forest, our university, is however located slightly further to the west, in the western part of North Carolina. It is a private university with Christian roots that was founded in 1864 as a small regional college. However, recently, for the last 20 years, we have been consistently ranked among the top 30 US research universities. We now have a School of Medicine, School of Law, Engineering, and School of Business, in addition to our undergraduate college with 8,000 students. Our Wake Forest campus is also ranked highly as far as studying abroad. Over 60% of our students study abroad for 1 or 2 semesters. Thus, we believe that we are quite an appropriate place for a forum on intercultural studies today. Also, our Wake Forest University is ranked very highly in the aesthetics category, most beautiful campus in the US. So we hope that you will be able to feel as if you are walking on our campus, thanks to our introductory slides for each session, where we actually have tried to give you a glimpse into the beauty of our campus. With Wake Chapel that has 213-foot steeple proudly standing in the campus center, with the library, the university library, rightly towering over the entire campus, and endless meadows of flowers in our central plazas. We are also honored and excited to share with you the celebration of 10 years of our interpreting and translation program here at Wake Forest. Our graduate program in Interpreting and Translation Studies has 2 main tracks, Chinese English and Spanish English. But we also have 2 very special and unique tracks that we believe are one of the very few in the entire world. One is Intercultural Studies in Healthcare, and the other one, that to my knowledge is actually the only one in the world, is Teaching of Interpreting. It used to be offered also a similar program at Macquarie University in Australia, but it doesn't seem to be offered there anymore. We are therefore proudly and joyfully celebrating 10 years of our program with 100 alumni working all over the world right now. And we would like to invite you to attend a historical forum with historical remarks, an overview that the co-founder of our program will present today later at 11:30 this morning. We're also holding a special session that features research projects of our Interpreting and Translation Studies alumni who are now young scholars in their last years of doctoral studies all over the world, or just starting their teaching academic career in their tenure track positions. This session, the special session that features research of our ITS alumni, will take place on Saturday. We also have another special session. This session on poetry translation will be led by Dr. Cheng Ching Song, Associate Professor at SUNY Binghamton. She's the Director of Translation, Research and Instruction Program. This session will take place today, and it's also sponsored by TIP, Translation, Research and Instruction Program at the State University of New York in Binghamton. I would like to acknowledge also our sponsors here at Wake Forest University. First of all, we thank to the Vice Provost Office for Global Affairs at Wake Forest University. We also thank East Asian Department of Languages and Cultures and the Center for Research on Abroad and International Student Engagement here at Wake Forest. We actually have a double reason for a celebration during this forum. Interpreting and Translation Studies shares this 10-year milestone with the forum. Similar to our program, APFTIS forum history goes back to 2011. The first APFTIS forum was held at Tsinghua University and Jinyang University of Finance and Economics in China in May 2011. And the most recent one, the 8th forum in 2019, was held at the Royal Institute of Technology in Bangkok, Thailand. And then there was a gap, of course, as we have been postponing it several times, but finally it's happening today. Therefore, we are so thrilled that APFTIS number 9 is finally taking place. Professor Xuan Luo is the founder and the most prominent person of the forum, and he will present the report on the current situation of APFTIS tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning. So now, to our today's together. We have two keynote renowned speakers. And as you might have noticed, the keynote speech today by Professor Anthony Kim focuses on interpreting, and tomorrow's speech by Professor Luchao Yi will focus on translation. We have over 200 participants who have registered for the forum from all 5 continents, all the 3 Americas, Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and we even have one person participating and joining us from Africa, from Algeria. So we are all very glad that we can be part of this great event. It is indeed a great example of trans-Pacific collaboration and interaction. On behalf of our Interpreting and Translation Studies faculty and graduate students, and on behalf of the entire Wake Forest community, on behalf of Guangxi University and Tsinghua University, we warmly welcome you. And I open the 9th Asian Pacific Forum on Translation and Intercultural Studies and wish you a very enjoyable, fruitful, and productive conference. In addition to our Zoom meetings, links to the entire forum, all sessions, and all keynote speeches are also live streamed on YouTube, Bilibili, and Douju. Now we will have a short break, and at 8:45, we'll return to welcome our first keynote speaker, Professor Anthony Kim. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening again. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, who actually welcomed me very warmly to the Interpreting and Translation Studies scholarly community when I was still a very young scholar 20 years ago, and he was a rising authority and celebrity in the field. Since then, we have had many interesting exchanges when meeting at various conferences in Sweden, Denmark, and most recently in his native Australia. Anthony Kim is Professor of Translation, Languages and Linguistics at the University of Melbourne. He is also the Distinguished Professor of Translation and Intercultural Studies at Rovira in Virgili University in Spain. At that university, he had founded a very successful program that he led for several years. That program was very well known across Europe and attracted young scholars from all continents. He has also led many research groups and directed several PhD dissertations that had been quite trailblazing at that time. Professor Pim also holds the title of Professor Extraordinary at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He was the fellow of the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies, visiting researcher at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, Walter Benjamin visiting professor at the University of Vienna, and from 2010 to 2016, he was the president of the European Society for Translation Studies. Professor Anthony Pim is known for his amazing and abundant contributions to translation studies and intercultural studies. His publications count in hundreds, over 300. The list is very, very long and continues to grow. His seminal works from the late 90s and the first decade of this century are still the main point of reference in many scholarly publications as well as doctoral theses, thus leading next generations of researchers through the meanders of the intricacies of translation history, ethics of translation, and training of future translators. Among his most important and known works are Translation and Text Transfer, Method in Translation History, the Moving Text Localization, Translation, and Distribution, and the one I particularly enjoyed the most and benefited a lot from was Negotiating the Frontier, Translators and Intercultures in Hispanic History, published in the year 2000. And most recently, he established translation solutions for many languages, as well as What is Translation History, focusing on trust, responsibility in translation and interpreting. Professor Pim likes to address controversial and surprising topics in a challenging, restructuring, and refreshing way. That's what we are hoping for to hear today: new concepts, new approaches, new perspectives, exploring, challenging, and redefining. So today, along the side of risk-taking and trust, he will be talking about risk-taking in interpreting. We welcome Professor Anthony Pim as our keynote speaker at our 9th Asian Pacific Forum on Translation and Intercultural Studies today. Please, Professor Anthony Pim, we welcome.
Many thanks, Ola, for that unnecessarily long introduction. It's great to see you there with sunshine and flowers, and here I am coming up to midnight in an autumn Melbourne, getting a bit cold. Okay, it's great to see you all. I'm so pleased that this forum eventually is taking place after the hiatus that we all know of and that I'll talk about a bit later. So my thanks especially to the organizers, to Professor Luo Xuanmin, the driving force behind this series of fora, and it's great to see you all there. Now, what I'm going to do tonight, is talk about risk management as a general way of understanding what interpreters can do, not necessarily have to do. And I'm not doing it as a specialist in interpreting. I regard this as a general approach to cross-cultural communication that concerns all forms of communication, written translation, interpreting, audiovisual, and you'll see a wider range of technological possibilities as we come up. However, I am focusing on interpreting today because this general approach has been criticized from a specialist in interpreting, Daniel Gilles, okay? The approach is not new, it's not mine. The first publication in translation studies on risk management was by Wolfram Wilks in 2005. My work on the concept took off around 2014, okay? And I used to give it as a series of talks just to try it out. To see what happens and get the criticisms and try to make it better. Then I give another talk on it, more criticisms, try to make it better. And then around 2015, I had enough of a coherent approach, I thought, to publish a synthetic text on it. And nothing much has happened, except for recently. That approach has been criticized by Daniel Gilles in 2001. and then even more recently by Sandra Halverson and Heidi Kotzer in 2022. So it's an exciting topic because it has a slight air of actualité. At last, somebody has paid attention to it enough to criticize it. So what I'm going to do is present the basics of the approach through examples. Okay, I'm not going to give you a course in risk management. I'm not going to go through all the concepts that I use or present any system. That's all published. You can find that as you like, and I've no need to repeat what I've been doing. What I'm going to do is present 3 examples and sort of illustrate the kinds of analysis that one can do with the set of ideas around the notion of risk management. Okay? And then I will, at the end, address the critiques from the very important translation scholars that have paid attention to this approach. So I'm starting from a doctoral thesis that I'm supervising. It's by Judith Reigal, and it's just been finished and will be defended in the coming months. And it's working on transcripts of court hearings, preliminary hearings in Barcelona, organized by the Miras Group at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And my co-director of this research is Carmen Bestué, who's a lawyer, who has a background in law. So it's a very interesting supervision process. I'm learning a lot about it. But what's really interesting is what happens in the courts in Barcelona. So basically here, I've just got this little snippet from a transcript that you can see. There we go. And the judge is asking somebody who has stolen a wallet or is accused of having stolen a wallet. And this is the 3rd time they have stolen something of this value, more than 140 euros or something like that. And the hearing is there because if they confess to the crime, then they are given a suspended sentence and they are basically deported. They get out of jail and they can leave the country, which is sort of a catch. That's the get out of jail free deal, okay? Why is that deal there? Well, it has to do with the number of cases, the overloading of the judicial system, but the element of justice requires that the accused, in this case the defendant, understands the nature of the plea that is being asked, okay? So the judge says to the interpreter, ask him, okay, if he agrees with what has been stated and accepts the charges, that is, pleads guilty, all right? So the interpreter turns around, so you accept the charges, right? This is in Spanish, the interpreter's working in English, or a kind of English. Defendant, to say, I robbed a wallet? Yeah. They have to free me? I say I'll rob it, and they set me free. Yep. Free me? Yep. Notice what's going on, this conversation between the interpreter and the defendant. The rest of the court, in theory, is speaking Spanish. So, I have said I robbed the wallet. They have to free me. Yep. Out. Good. Interpreter, sí, acepta. Y tiene que dejarlo en libertad. Yes, he accepts, and he has to be set free. All right. It goes on a bit, but I'll just focus on this here. Now, what intrigues me here is that most translation scholars, interpreting scholars, because it's an interpreter, would look at this and be shocked. It breaks just about every rule that we care to teach our students and most of the items in any code of ethics for interpreters, especially court interpreters. I've just put in red the things that might be shocking. And the deviation from accepted norms sort of begins, for me at least, with the instruction from the judge. which it doesn't ask the interpreter to convey a statement or an utterance that's to be repeated. It asks the interpreter to formulate a question, as if the interpreter were speaking in the first person. And following up from that invitation from the judge, there does ensue this conversation, which would be a side conversation, where the interpreter is obviously no longer interpreting in the strict sense of the word. But the exchanges here do reach an outcome and do reach the decision, the reply that the judge is obviously looking for. So instead of looking at that and just writing up all the mistakes and imperfections, this is not best practice, I'm aware of this, I'm interested in asking why. Why does this happen? And is there a logic behind it? What are these people doing? I know it's wrong in theory, but why are they doing it? And that sort of question requires something more than the application of rules or norms or criteria of accuracy, for example. Now, the way I take up this analysis is to ask for each person in the interaction, what is the worst thing that could possibly happen? Okay, I assume that people want to avoid something bad. I don't know what they want to go towards because I'm not inside their brains, and I hesitate to construe intention or actual meaning behind utterances. Everything has to be interpreted. I'm interpreting the situation, and I start by saying, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? So for the judge, in terms of justice, the worst thing would be that the defendant does not understand the requirements of the court and does not enter a valid plea. That is, there has to be justice. And so the judge adopts an attitude that we would describe as being risk averse. Risk averse means the judge spells out the rules done prior to this and then asks the interpreter to ensure that those rules, that the deal is understood. Okay, and in doing so, allows the interpreter to take part of that risk. So there's a second attitude here, which is risk transfer. Risk aversion, explain it well. Risk transfer, make sure the interpreter does that on the judge's behalf. Okay, so that is risk transfer. You move the risk from your action to somebody else's action, and you have to trust them in order to make that connection. So trust is a part of what's going on here as well. Now, for the defendant, this is actually more complicated, but the worst thing for the defendant is probably to spend more time in jail. The defendant just wants to get out of jail, and their attitude is probably risk aversion. They would accept the plea bargain and get out with a suspended sentence. They could have other attitudes. They could take the risk of going to a full trial if they have a very good lawyer and some actual evidence, but failing that, they are probably, quite logically, act in a risk-averse way by accepting the plea bargain. We don't know if the person is guilty or innocent. We don't have to know. It's the logic of what ensues says they adopt a risk-averse strategy. What's the worst thing for the interpreter, though? That would be the loss of credibility. Why? Because the interpreter is being paid by the court and actually by a company that's employed by the court. If the judge no longer believes in the word of the interpreter, if the interpreter loses credibility, they lose their entire function within that system. And so the interpreter's attitude here is risk averse. The interpreter does whatever possible to ensure the outcome that both the other sides seek. That is, yes, guilty, out of jail. Okay, both are happy with that. That's the logical thing that the interpreter should seek in order to keep the others in a cooperative relationship. Now, in doing that, in the extended conversation that I haven't shown you, unfortunately, the interpreter goes a bit too far in seeking this cooperative outcome, and actually says to the defendant, yes, you remember you discussed this with your lawyer beforehand and you agreed then. And trying to reinforce the deal, trying to give even more guarantees. Unfortunately, that kind of risk transfer, which is actually transferring it back to the counsel, to the lawyer, which was provided to the defendant, that second risk transfer really turns out to be incredibly risk-taking, because that supposes that the previous conversation was binding and therefore applies in the hearing. In legal terms, that is far from the case. The previous conversation from the lawyer is not at all binding. And if you look at the exchange closely, the defendant's plea is not based on a clear understanding in that trial situation. In fact, it's assuming that the previous decision with the lawyer is the decision made in the trial. It's a preliminary hearing, not a full trial. So my co-director of the thesis at this point becomes absolutely alarmed and says, that's the point where it goes absolutely wrong because of the second risk transfer. For me, though, I mean, I recognize that as being a problem. But if that hadn't happened, this could be a very successful exchange between people who arrange themselves quite quickly in such a way that an outcome is achieved that is cooperative in the sense that it's beneficial for all parties. Beneficial for the judge, beneficial for the defendant in this case, and beneficial for the interpreter. And it is relatively efficient, therefore beneficial for the judicial system. So what have I done there? I have taken something that looks entirely wrong, and I've tried to ask why people do this, and I found that there are reasons why they would do this. And the reasons they're doing it is to avoid negative outcomes. That is, they are managing the risks that are involved in each of their actions. That's the end of my first example. What's different here? I'm not talking about role boundaries. I'm not talking about ethics, whereas most of the codes of ethics actually do that. I'm talking about a kind of risk management that is based on cooperation. That's what we try to achieve in our conversations and exchanges at all levels, and at actual communicative outcomes. Why am I doing that? Not because I really care about the judicial system in Barcelona, which has many, many, many faults, far worse than the one there. It's because in my recent research on COVID-19 health communication here in Victoria, in Australia, we are finding that a straight translation is not enough. It's not enough to get people to accept vaccination or to understand the reality of the pandemic that we've been going through. And so we see the work of translators in the narrow equivalent sense being picked up and complemented by lots and lots of people in the various cult communities, the culturally and linguistically diverse communities that we have here. We have more than 250 languages spoken in Melbourne, and those messages get out through people doing things that are very similar to that in the court, things that go beyond the narrow ethics of equivalence or accuracy-based interpreting, and come close to re-narration, adaptation, speaking in the first person. Why? Because the risks are great, and the best way to manage those risks is to ensure communication above all. That's one reason why I'm doing it. My question then is, as a teacher, as somebody who trains translators and interpreters, more translators than interpreters, I confess, how can we teach translation without assuming equivalence? Can we really hold up that kind of behavior as a model? And I suggest not. But let me move on to my second example, which comes from healthcare interpreting. This one's from a doctoral thesis that I supervised some years ago on non-standard Spanish in the United States and translation, okay, and interpreting, I think, by Beatriz Cortamaria. And she was looking at what goes on in hospitals. Particularly, she was interested in Spanglish, in non-standard Spanish being used in the United States, and do the interpreters use standard Spanish or non-standard Spanish, and what are the reasons for it? But her data contain things that are rather more interesting for me, okay? And here I'm just focusing on some that concern terminology, medical terminology. So the doctor asks, have they done an endoscopy? I don't know if you can see that, but if your doctor's holding that and they're going to stick it in you, you're really worried, okay? Interpreter says, have they looked inside with a camera? So what's happened? The interpreter knows that this term is not going to be understood, and they've used a paraphrase that has a chance of being understood, although it's probably just as scary. Again, did you have a miscarriage? Did you lose a baby in pregnancy? What's being done? The more technical terms that are likely to be misunderstood are being rephrased, okay? And I'll just go on to a few other things. That's one thing that we find happening, that is paraphrase, explanation, making things understood, and that's what we need. In other cases, though, we find the interpreters using the English term in their Spanish for Down syndrome. Why would they do that? It's because the person is going to need to know that term as part of their health literacy in order to navigate the hospital system, and the interpreter is sort of teaching that this is the term you have to use. Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, same thing, and TAP, same thing here, okay? So the interpreter is, in those cases, teaching the person the English terms. They're learning some English that they're going to need as part of health literacy. And why they do that is fairly obvious if you think about it, but we will explain it in a minute. And in this case, there's a false friend, taxes with taxes, and they're asking, in fact, about los impuestos. So the interpreter here is giving the correct term. She's actually correcting the Spanish that the patient is using. But okay, I won't go into that. If you know Spanish in the United States, you'll figure that one out. Okay, so what's interesting here is that the interpreter is again assuming roles that go beyond narrow equivalence-based translation and is in fact doing something like pedagogical interpreting. This is all part of situation management, and Ola has actually studied the various kinds of situation management that are available in various situations. Now, again, I just ask, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? And we'll ask this question not just for the parties, because they're all more or less in agreement. The risk number one, the worst thing that can happen, is the patient doesn't understand what's being said. That's a short-term communication problem. But there's a risk to, number two, the patient doesn't gain any health literacy, long-term communication. So risk one explains the reformulations. Risk two explains the presence of English in the Spanish. And they are both pertinent risks, but operating at different timescales. The interpreter senses when one timescale is important and when the other kicks in and is important. Risk 3, it should be there, is obviously if the doctor does not trust the interpreter. In fact, the interpreter and translator's greatest risk is always that of losing credibility. So sometimes the interpreter will use the correct term and then give the reformulation. This tells the doctor, yes, I know what you're talking about, and it tells the patient on the other side, and this is what the doctor means. That can work both ways. So what we find in these examples in terms of risk management is really quite complex, because if you go one way, you lose something on the other side. Okay, so the use of common language, making it readily understandable, helps the person on this side, the patient, but risks losing the credibility of the doctor because you're not using the correct terms. Okay, so you might go a bit that way, but be aware that in the next sentence or prior to that or in some other way, indicate to the doctor, yes, you know the correct medical terms yourself. Otherwise, you lose credibility. Trade-off 2, use the English term, and then you risk the patient not understanding, but you have enhanced the long-term literacy, the capacity to navigate the medical system, and you're keeping the doctor that side because the doctor can hear that you're using the correct term. Trade-off 3, give the patient the correct term. That's what happens there. And trade-off 4, you can, of course, combine any of the above. So what's interesting in these examples is that there's not just one risk strategy. There's a combination of criteria, and for each particular situation, you're going a bit that way or a bit that way, or combining them and giving the two at the same time, which is entirely possible. You can say endoscopia, mirar dentro con camera. You can use the technical term and then the reformulation, as good teachers should do. And so here we find from apparently simple examples, we're getting into the logic of trade-offs as a risk attitude. My former student, Bei Hu, is working on this in the reception of translations, and she's calling them compromises. So it's the same thing. In a previous publication, we called this risk mitigation. I think the clearest term at the moment for me is trade-off. And the model of the trade-off, if you want to understand what's going on, is in the sprinkler systems. Some of you might have above you where you are now. In case of fire, these days offices have sprinkler systems. So if the building catches alight and there's a fire, down comes the water, the fire goes out, but your carpet and your books and your paper all get wet. But they calculate that the damage from the water is less than the damage from the fire. That's a trade-off, okay? And the interpreters here for each situation seem to be quite good at assessing which damage is going to be less. Okay, now I'm moving on to another example. This one is where I have to tread very carefully. This one's from Daniel Gilles. It's an empirical piece of research that he carried out. It's on an interview. The text is an interview. A journalist with an incoming CEO of Kodak, of a company there. And this is a fragment of the speech that was interpreted, I think, by some 10 interpreters. And what Gilles did that is interesting. He got them to interpret it once, and then he got them to interpret it again. And he looked at the differences in the two performances. Presumably in the second rendition, they knew what was coming, so they had more cognitive freedom to allocate their efforts. And he was looking at how those efforts were reallocated. Okay, so he was doing it to test one thing, the tightrope hypothesis, that errors and omissions for him depend on the nature of the interpreter's cognitive activity and not on inherent text difficulty. And I have no problem in recognizing that outcome. but I'm interested in risk, which is a different thing. Now, what's interesting here for me is that the interpreters rendered this, and this is from Daniel Gilles, and they made a number of errors and omissions. Note that errors are in the same category as omissions. So an omission for Gilles in this study is counted as an error. And I was thinking, well, wait a minute. You know, sometimes people leave things out and it's not an error. It's in fact an intelligent thing to do. For example, I'll just go back. Look, there's a false start there. I'm sure I don't even know these people. Any interpreter is going to leave out that false start. But you can't go there and include that as an error. I don't think so for me. And then I went through and I looked at the actual omissions that these interpreters made. And here you can see what they collectively made. It's not saying one interpreter didn't make all these omissions, but I put them together and I saw that just about everybody left out the false start. But look at all those other phrases that were omitted. And it occurs to me that those particular phrases that were being omitted don't affect the discourse. We get the essential information, and we can see that in the text, some parts of it are very, very important, and other parts are very unimportant and can be omitted with no substantial loss. And I made the mistake of calling those high-risk, low-risk parts of texts. I would now follow Daniel Gilles and call them high-stakes parts and low-stakes parts. So if you leave out those things like I'm sure or yet or the engineers, no harm comes. Those are low stakes, all right? But if you leave out this little bit here, a lot of harm comes. Now, in my rereading and analysis of this, I just looked at the situation where the journalist is interviewing the CEO, and it's like a cat and mouse game. The journalist wants fresh information. The CEO doesn't want to give any information. And that as long as that cat and mouse game is there, and the only bit of information that's given is this. So this is the bit that both parts want. All right. Both parts can cooperate on this little bit getting across. And the rest is just playing around. Playing around in an intelligent way, as people do when they have conversation, but playing around nevertheless. I would go further these days. Kodak used to make film, right? So the silver halide captured media. When was the last time you bought some film to take a photo? When was the last time you saw Kodak filed for bankruptcy, right? Well after this interview. But one could imagine this interview being televised, and as soon as the incoming CEO recognizes that he has no strategy to rebrand the company, now that we know that everybody can take photos on their phone, I'm trying to hold up a phone that you can't see, all right, and they don't need Kodak film, as soon as he says that phrase, the stocks for Kodak are going to plummet because people watch these interviews and bet on them, bet on the outcomes and buy and sell shares in the companies. All right, so that's the bit you want to get. That one's high stakes and the other's not, okay? And that means that the interpreters actually made low stakes omissions, and I don't think that's bad. Daniel Gilles does, because he has a different view of what the interpreter's role is. And what intrigued me is that when the interpreters did the second performance, the omissions that were covered up, that were restored, were in the high stakes parts of the text, the bits that were more important. So it seemed to me that the interpreters were distributing their cognitive efforts in accordance with the probability to avoid negative outcomes. That's what I mean by stakes, all right? And it seems logical that they would do that intuitively without having to analyze any great contextual conflicts or strategies. It's something that we sense in a conversation, as Grice says, the conversation is going in a general direction and the parties agree that that's the direction it's going in, that's what we want to achieve, and the interpreters were doing that. The theoretical importance, though, of what I was trying to get at there is that omission should not be counted as an error necessarily. Sometimes it absolutely is, but not always. And it should be counted as an effort. And as the interpreters among you must know, Daniel Gilles has an efforts model where there are 4 efforts, but omission is not one of them. And that's what really has upset him, I think. I was, in fact, trying to deconstruct a rather precarious categorization of a very, very complex cognitive activity. Now, I can take that kind of analysis of text that people work on, or speeches, and extract rather simple rules from it. And this is what I do tell my students: only work hard when the stakes are high. I mean, work hard, but work hard when it really counts, and don't work too hard when not. I mean, texts are very, very different. Some parts are really important, others are not. Unfortunately, some of my students only learn part of the lesson, that they don't have to work too hard, and then they're surprised when they fail an exam. Now, what's interesting for me is that I started, this was some years ago, when I started to deal with this kind of text in class and discuss it and get people to talk about where they could leave something out, where a mistake would not be important. We start to discuss what interpreters do without having to refer to equivalents. This would be the way I would approach beginners who come in and typically want to use high effort for everything, all right, or low effort for nothing. If they think interpreting or translation is going to be easy, this is for translation and interpreting. And it seems to me this is a rationalism that is going to be criticized by other people, as we will see soon, that if you have a low probability of adverse effect, that's low stakes, all right, you should not invest great effort, use risk aversion, that is avoid the risk, tone it down, generalize, or risk transfer, be close to the ST, be close to the start text, that's a risk transfer, or do what the client tells you, that's risk transfer, or cite somebody else's advice, that's risk transfer, like we saw in the court situation. Over here, I think it's logical to have high effort being invested in high stakes communication. When a lot depends on it, when a lot depends, you work hard. And there you would use risk transfer if necessary, or risk taking. And this is very, very important, that in this very simple model, which seems to be telling people it's okay to be lazy, not at all. I want people to take risks and do spectacular things when it's really important, when attention has to be drawn to something, when a message really has to get across, or as in vaccine information, we're concerned with changing behavior. I want mediators to do risk-taking things there that will reach great success. Got to be careful about the vaccine. Perhaps I shouldn't stress risk-taking with vaccines. All right. What we have to avoid, though, is people working hard on everything, as beginners tend to do. They want to check every reference. They have doubts about everything. That's overwork and inefficient. Or low effort where it counts, and that's guesswork, and that leads to perdition, as we see when we mark exams. All right. So this is using risk management as a very simple logic for training people. How do we train people? What are the basic strategies we train them in? I've never said everybody works this way. I would not like to be interpreted as saying everybody works this way. I know they don't. I know there are other things, particularly the ruse of trust, as I call it, where in a low stakes part of the text, you make a stupid translation mistake. Your client sees that and they believe you don't know the other language, you lose credibility, and the whole thing goes down the drain. That has happened to me as a translator. So as logical and rational as it seems, other things can happen in a translation job, and you can't just go around making errors anywhere because you say, oh, I didn't think it mattered. No, at some level, it all matters, and the greatest risk posed to the translator or interpreter is the loss of credibility. Don't forget that. That's the ruse of trust. How am I going for time? Let me see. Terrible. Dear me. I'm going to skip that. I just want to point out that I'm not training people to be lazy. These are the kinds of activities we've been doing in class. We look at the concepts that require absolute re-elaboration in order to be understood, in this case, in Chinese. With my Chinese students, they had real difficulty with all those concepts, and the solution for that kind of communication was to go back and rewrite the text in English, rewrite the health messaging at the source in order to manage the risks later on. And this is another activity we've been doing in recent weeks. It has to do with risk management. That's why I'm putting it here. I don't want to get into a narrow argument about accuracy and conference interpreting and things. We have these possible technologies that can be used. Some are high effort, some are low effort, and we have these tasks. And the students have to connect the workflow with the task. All right, so if you're translating a speech by the president of Russia, I did this before the president of Russia was quite as problematic as he is now. There we would, I think, do fully human translation with double revision and review. Okay, high stakes, high effort. But this is the kind of work that we need today when we have all kinds of technologies for translation and for interpreting, all kinds of degrees of attention that can be paid to the text, and we have widespread use of raw machine translation, which is fine for some purposes. And in all of these, you have to figure out, obviously, what's the worst thing that could happen. Another point I would make here is that the theory of risk management doesn't say everybody is free to do whatever they like when they think it doesn't matter. Your agency is relative to opportunity. So conference interpreters, simultaneous interpreters, have less time in order to engage in situation management and do things. And in fact, what we saw them doing in those omissions was very close to what a consecutive interpreter might do. By reducing, you take all those omissions, it gets down to 23% less, similar to what a consecutive interpreter would do. And the consecutive interpreter has more scope to make judicious omissions, in fact, the requirement to do so. And then the public services interpreters in the courts or in the healthcare system have more opportunity for situation management, therefore more agency, and can engage in more actions that would pertain to risk management. So I don't want to suggest that it's the same for everybody. Obviously, some agency is relative to opportunity. In summary, those are the 4 kinds of risk attitudes that I deal with. The one that remains to be elaborated is perhaps risk-taking, but Think of literary translation, think of publicity translation, game localization. I mean, there are many areas where obviously risk-taking is needed and creativity is appreciated and rewarded. Now, why turn to risk management? As I've said several times, I think we've lost the faith in equivalence. It was a very strong paradigm for a long time. Those beliefs are now fragile. We are aware that every text, every situation has to be interpreted. I would make the claim, but I haven't got the evidence here to present, that equivalent-based translators tend to be risk-averse. And Daniel Gill's work there, when he does mention risk, it's always as something bad. You know, do not take a risk, avoid the risk, play it safe. Do not spend too long rendering a metaphor, because the risk is you will miss the incoming sentence. Sure, that's obvious, but risk is always negative. For me, it's not negative. Risk is something positive. It's good to take risks in some situations. I'm seeing a market that requires more than equivalence-based translation, especially in our studies on COVID communication. And that means we must train mediators who are acutely aware of contextual factors, rather than assume that the mediators, the translators or interpreters don't really know about context. Now for the critique. Daniel Gill has come back at me. You saw I was reanalyzing one of his studies. He didn't like my analysis. I'm sorry, because a lot of it was very good and full of praise for his work, and he has done some very, very important work in the field. So I'm, obviously recognizing that, but he didn't like it. Anyway, what does he say? He says risk management does not explain everything. Yeah, of course it doesn't explain everything. I've never set out to explain everything. I was, when I wrote a recent paper, it's called risk. I don't know what's it called. It's got three concepts. It's got risk, and it's got trust, and it's got cooperation. So I need those three things. I need, and I've used all those terms so far. So risk management, certainly, he's correct there. I changed my terminology to high stakes. I changed risk mitigation to risk aversion. These are all things I've learned from Daniel Gill. And Gill says risk is more often a constraint than a driver. I agree very much. He says we should look at achievement-oriented decision-making. I agree very much. That's why I talk about cooperation as the general social goal of all communication, and therefore of translation and interpreting. So on all those points, I would agree with the critiques, and I don't know why he gets so upset about it. Where I run aground, though, and where there is a basic difference is in the elements of critique, which I see as being essentialist. Essentialist simply means that one takes an utterance and assumes there is the meaning of it, and that it's the mediator's task to grasp that meaning. For me, as a non-essentialist, all utterances have to be interpreted. They can be interpreted in different ways. And the idea of having one simple meaning is really a test of power and authority. So Gilles brings out a sense of cognitive risk, which is the risk of making, it's again there, errors and omissions. So errors and omissions are put into the one thing, and risk is always negative. There's no positive risk-taking in Gilles' approach. And then risk management seems therefore to be opposed to something like fidelity. So I've got something, it's difficult to imagine how a translated poem would look and read if it were determined to a large extent by risk management. No, I've never said that anybody sets out to translate a poem in order to avoid risks. That's not the purpose. And the purpose is to gain cooperation between the communication participants, and the risk is of not gaining it. Okay, but nobody sets out, nobody sets up a company just to manage risk. They set up a company to make money, and the risk is that you don't get money. And underlying that is the basic assumption that you find in Gilles, old Gilles and new Gilles, in between Gilles, that the conference interpreter has to work from the incoming text, the discourse that's coming in, because the interpreter knows less than the people in the conference. The interpreter is at a disadvantage and cannot make decisions that should be made by the experts in the field. Sure, that may indeed be the case. I find plenty of examples where they are doing that. And I find numerous examples outside of conference interpreting where it's necessary that they make those kinds of decisions. I move on to Halvorsen and Kotze. There's a reference there, 2022. And in their title, they've got, this is their title, yeah, do we really need concepts like norms and risks when we have a comprehensive usage-based theory of language? So I've likened this to, I've gone over time, to selling a washing powder, right? They look at Gideon Theory's concept of norms, my use of risk management, and they say, yes, that's good, but it's not good enough. And yes, that's good, but it's not good enough. And both those things are in our super new product that includes all the elements of the previous inferior products, okay? So selling this new usage-based theory of language. I'll just go quickly through what they say. So yes, I reckon we do need norms and risks because the linguistic theory is boring and you can't use it for teaching people. And my thinking about this was basically in order to teach people, to get people to think critically about what they're doing. Halvorsen and Kotze assume that the risk model is based on rationalism, assumes a rational human subject, and that is very true. And then cite an economist who just says, you know, people do not optimize. So when I say work hard on the high stakes bit, that's a rational proposition. I think you would agree. And Halvorsen and Kotze say, well, people don't do that. People are stupid. I know people are stupid. I never set out to model human behavior. I think that students come to me because they want to get beyond their previous behavior, and that a little bit of rationalism in the model doesn't hurt. That is, finding a logic behind what people do doesn't hurt either, but that risk-taking goes beyond the rational model. And what I said about the roots of trust, for example, upsets a narrow rationalism as well. And if I find a logic in people doing terrible things in the court interpreting situation, another example I worked on was an interpreter in Afghanistan. When you find a social logic in that, it's like Bourdieu with the leçons pratiques, a practical sense. You're drawing out not just the rationalism of the superior Enlightenment mind, you're drawing out the logics of what people actually do in social behavior. I'm almost near the end. Halvorsen and Kotze think that I am arguing against linguistics. Not at all. That's why I published my main text on risk management in the Journal of Pragmatics. I think pragmatics is a part of linguistics. I'm happy to have published in that. I've spent many years teaching sociolinguistics. And here's the last one in terms of ontological status. So Sandra Halvorsen brings out the big O word, ontological, and she says, my theory is working towards the social with cooperation. That's true. And the cognitive with the management of uncertainty. That's true. And she says, we can't see how they are put together. They're put together easily for me. Cooperation is a social goal. Decisions are made to achieve that goal. That is the practical sense of what people do. And if you want to argue about the philosophy of the ontology of the cognitive reaching the social, It's not something we do in translation studies. We can have the argument in philosophy, if you like, but it goes well beyond any of the concerns that I personally have in translation and interpreting. Concepts, the work I do, I produce concepts. I work on concepts. Concepts are there to solve historical problems. Gideon Toury had a great concept, norms. It was there to solve the historical problem of a discipline that had isolated observations about translations and had to put them together. It worked, okay? Risk management is a concept like that. It's not to describe all human behavior. It's not to pretend to see into the soul of any particular person. The deep problem that I have been working on in my work on risk management is how to live with indeterminacy, how to live in a world where everything we have has to be interpreted and there is all around us uncertainty. When I turned to risk management, I found that economists especially, and a few philosophers, had been dealing with that problem for about 50 years before I entered that domain. I have learned from them. I continue to learn from them. I invite you to do the same. Thank you for your attention. Do we have time for questions? I think we do.
Yes. Thank you very much, Anthony. We have 15 minutes for questions, and this was fascinating, but not only fascinating, but very important and constantly happening in the classroom and in the internships. Like, students want to know what they are supposed to do. So something similar that we have introduced with Rebecca was emancipatory translation or interpreting based on Andrew Chesterman. So, but I think what you said is mostly relevant to dialogue and community interpreting, not that much simultaneous. Maybe that's why Daniel Gilles is a little bit maybe confused about that. But thank you very much. I think that constantly we are hearing those questions from students, making decisions. So we suggested with Rebecca in our work that you can make those decisions as long as you can justify them. So for me, this risk management or risk mitigation goes back to co-power. So the way we're going to take questions, we already have the first one actually coming from China, from Bilibili, translated by our moderators and submitted through chat. So I will ask this question, and then in order to have some more human interaction, we are going to take the risk of letting people unmute themselves if they want to ask questions, and we'll see how it goes. After this first question, we have about 15 to 20 minutes, and we then can unmute themselves and come on screen in person, and we'll see how risk mitigation and taking will go in this session. So here's the first one coming from Bilibili, from one of our participants. Does this, what you have just described, provide any reflection on using plain language when managing in interpreting? By plain language, the person that asks is referring to concise and simple language without hedging, repeating language fillers. So especially when some terminologies are difficult in translation training.
Yes, absolutely. That's the project I'm working on at the moment, actually. Not so much plain language in what interpreters produce, because we're finding that lots of the problems in the COVID communication was the lack of plain language in the original start texts. In Australia's case, the English language texts that are then interpreted into numerous languages. So it's known, it's very clear, that plain language enhances comprehension. What's not clear is how that reacts with individual cultures, because there are cultures like Italian, for example, where an authoritative message is not plain but elaborate. So there are other considerations to be borne in mind there. But absolutely, yes. In general, I plead the case of plain language and actually exploring the ways in which plain language in the start text enhance machine translation performance. So a lot of work, a lot of quick translations can be done by just pre-editing in plain language. I know that goes beyond interpreting, but those are the issues that we're working on in Australia.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this answer. And we have another question coming from Dr. Burgos, please.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Mr. Pim, for this interesting talk. I think we would like to have more time to talk about, how do you understand, for example, equivalence, which is seems to be, like a key term in order to be able to determine when equivalence can be effective or not. But I know time is limited. But my question goes more along the lines of how a strategy about risk management can be implemented in the classroom. If we consider, for example, that the interpreters may be biased, unconsciously, of course, many times about what they are, the matter they are interpreting, mainly when the matter is sensitive. So it could influence, as I said, it could influence what the interpreter considers low stakes or high stakes, and take him to make several or various decisions in terms of what can be omitted and what cannot. And that may be influenced by the fact that each interpreter may have a different system of beliefs. So how do you foresee that could be sort of, managed in a classroom in order to teach students following this perspective?
Thank you. Very quickly, I don't believe in substantial equivalence. Every utterance has to be interpreted. Secondly, the conversation in the teaching situation should evolve around what's the worst thing that could happen, and therefore get to what's the most desirable thing that could happen where these people are agreeing. And if an interpreter has a very strong personal belief that is intervening there, the legitimate question is to ask, what are the other parties in the communication going to think about that, and how will they react to it? Will it achieve a cooperative outcome? Sometimes interpreters want to disrupt, and that can be a legitimate occupation if they want. They are simply cooperating with other people, not the ones present. But that's a far more advanced discussion.
Great, thank you very much for your answer for this. We have another person, Dr. Zhu, would like to ask a question, please.
Okay, Professor Pin, thank you for the speech. It's very interesting and inspiring. And one biggest takeaway for me is to ask interesting questions. That's the biggest takeaway for me. That's very, very interesting. I have two questions. Question number one, when you say the interpreters, the greatest risk is to lose the credibility, because my understanding is always like the greatest risk is the legal consequences. So I don't know, it's like, I don't know what you think of that. Question number two, when you say risk aversion or risk tolerance based on Hofstede's cultural dimension model, that some cultures are more tolerant to risks. Some cultures are more like to avoid risks. So of course, this is probably down the road, but have you ever thought about, are there any cultural differences in terms of like risk management? That's all my questions.
Thank you. The second question, obviously there are cultural differences. I actually do the Kodak text that you saw there. I've been doing it in class for about 10 years. And we get people to color in where you can make emissions and where you can't, so red and green, right? And it's very clear that the Asian students are risk averse. And when I was in the United States, the American students are very the American students have lots of green and the Asian students have lots of red. Perhaps they just like those colors, I don't know. But yes, obviously there are cultural predispositions. I don't want to base any theory of translating on Hofstede, however, because when people come together to have a conversation, they are in a very specific situation with a mutually beneficial goal to be attained. They're not there to defend their countries. I'm sorry. They're not there to defend their cultures or predispositions. They are there to reach a mutually beneficial outcome. And that is where we see those predispositions modified and adapted. So I recognize the differences, but I certainly do not believe they are insurmountable.
Great, thank you very much. Actually, we have a question coming from one of our students here, graduate students. So Kylie, please, you are welcome to ask your question. Kylie.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I found it extremely interesting. And I'm actually working on a paper right now with Dr. Burgos regarding subjectivity and objectivity in translation. And your risk theory, I found very interesting for quality assurance purposes. Do you feel like subjectivity could be viewed in a risk management way in that not all subjective choices are wrong and they should be measured based on their risk and how it affects the reception of the translation?
Yes, yes, and yes. Does that keep you happy? Especially in cases, and there are many, when ST1 can be rendered as TT1, TT2, TT3, and there is no consequential difference between those alternatives. And the task of the translator is to pick one of them and go with it. I mean, it's just, the speed is one of the factors there. Now, is that subjectivity? I guess so, because one translator will pick one and another one will pick another, but often there is no discernible consequence from those differences. We simply have different ways of dealing with complex problems. So yes, yes, and yes. The real problem is when there is that really important bit of the text where the whole outcome depends on it, and there subjectivity has to be modified. There we might look around and do a bit of risk transfer. We might ask the client. We might consult with another translator. Or when all of us fails and we're not too sure of what we're doing, we might just go really close to the text. Because if we're wrong, we can always say, hey, it was in the text anyway. So I agree with everything you said, but I don't see any panacea coming from praise of the translator's subjectivity.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you feel like quality assurance processes for the translation reviewers could be adapted to evaluate risk instead of errors?
Absolutely, because some parts of texts are high stakes and errors there count a lot. But that's what the old localization models did. You know, I think the Lees one had critical error. It was 10 times more, you know, any other error, which was an amazing weighting. But sure, that would be a logical thing to do.
Okay,
not
thank you.
10 times, but yeah, less.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Another question from the chat, from the audience, an interesting one and a very short one. Here's the question. What about the greatest risk? What is the greatest risk?
Well,
that's the question.
Oh, no, that was the question before, the legal consequences. Well, the risk for the interpreter, as an intermediary, the greatest risk is losing credibility. Why? Because each of the parties can't know what you're doing with the other party. There's always the risk of you being a traitor, always that risk. And your only guarantee of not being seen as a traitor is your credibility, the belief they have that what you are saying is a valid representation of some aspect of what is incoming from the other side. That's why the credibility is there. Legal consequences, I suggest that the legal consequences, I avoided the question, may come as a consequence of the loss of credibility. Okay, but I don't think, well, we would have to consider specific situations. I mean, we've had recent work on interpreters in war interpreters interpreting situations of torture, and there obviously there's a certain risk of credibility, but there's also risks of absolute participating in inhumane actions, which may be more powerful. Okay, but I won't get into that. That's a debate for ethics, and I have dealt with that elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from our student here at Wake Forest, Laura Ewald. You're welcome to ask your question now. You can unmute and bring on your video. Laura, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was incredibly interesting and educational, especially as a student. But my question pertains to with the increase in the use of remote interpreting, especially like in response to COVID-19, how do you think that affects risk management, especially in like the first two examples you provided, which would often be in person before COVID, but maybe would be remote now?
Yeah, interpreters have discovered that they can do it. Just like teachers, we've discovered that we can actually teach online. And I think I got okay at teaching online. Now I'm back in the classroom and it's very enjoyable, I must admit. But we discovered we can do it. I don't see any necessary drawback to remote interpreting, especially these days with the technologies we have, and you can have different cameras to see what's going on in the courtroom as well. I really do not see any necessary increased risk. And I see a lot of savings.
Okay, great, thank you. And Maya Leach, another graduate student. Please, Maya, you can ask your question now.
Hi, Dr. Pam. Thank you so much for providing us with this information. I found your discussion really intriguing. But the most intriguing part for me was the discussion about omission being looked at as, well, needing cognitive efforts distributed in a particular way. My question for you is, do you think that interpreter training leads to this ability to distribute the cognitive efforts for omission effectively, or does it come more so from experience?
That's a very good question. Daniel Gilles would suggest the other way. Gilles has a model of the completely trained interpreter whose goal is to have the satisfaction of doing a good job. All right? So there's no goal to satisfy anybody else outside. The ultimate goal is the satisfaction of doing a good job. And I can understand that because I've been an interpreter and there is a real satisfaction there. Okay? But is that the criteria on which we're going to judge the performance? I suggest not. I suggest that the satisfaction of the other parties, the credibility, the cooperation, all those things are just as important. Now, I've forgotten the crux of your question, which was what? Can you remind me, please?
Yes, for the ability to cognitively use effort to distribute the distribution of the cognitive efforts, does that come more so from training or experience? Okay.
What we do see in written translation, because I can use eye tracking and see this, is that novices have a constant investment of effort in all parts of the text. It tends to be, problem, solution, like that. Whereas the people with more training, final year master students, it's solution, problem, big problem, solution, problem. It's far more uneven. They are redistributing effort so that it focuses on the big juicy problems, and they're not wasting time on the problems for which they have automatic or semi-automated responses. I don't know for interpreting because we don't have the same tools to study the cognitive process of interpreters, but I suspect it is true as well.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I don't see any more hands raised up, so I will read this last question that came in the chat. This will be our last question, unless somebody would like to bring another question before I read this one out. No, everybody's good. Okay, so here's the last question coming from the chat, also from a student here, actually one of my students. Here is what Sarah is asking. In my interpreting class at Wake Forest, we have learned about many different terms that outline the roles and the responsibilities of the interpreter. In your opinion, Professor Pim, if you had to give one role that you would put at the forefront or that the interpreter should assume, which role would you say is the most important in order to achieve the goal of enhancing communication? Cultural broker, neutral, intermediary, or communication facilitator?
Is that a choice? No.
I don't know. That's what she said.
It depends so much. It really
Sarah,
does depend.
I don't know if Sarah wants to clarify.
It depends on each situation. It would be like that interpreter in the healthcare system where sometimes they're giving the English word, sometimes they're giving the Spanish word, sometimes they're mixing both, right?
She just said not a choice, any role that she would provide. Just in the chat, she said, yeah.
I like all of those descriptions. Okay, there's none of them that I would outlaw at the moment. Okay.
Great.
What about you, Ola? As your student, what's your favorite?
My favorite is co-power. And I tell them the oscillation mode of the pendulum, so increased and incremental intervention. So whenever you have to intervene and you have to justify your choice, go for it, right? So make your choices, but you have to defend your choice if I ask you why you did that or not. So omission, the transparency 100%, but sometimes you have to omit, you have to summarize, you have to let things go as long as you can justify, because we cannot foresee all the settings, all the scenarios and all the possibilities. But I think we can teach our students how they can make those decisions. So that's my take. What do you think? What do you think about this incremental intervention model?
There's a problem with empowerment. Seriously, a problem with empowerment. I'll give you the example. We find it with Aboriginal communities in Australia where the Aboriginal interpreter is in the court. And if the decision goes against the Aboriginal defendant, the interpreter is considered responsible by the people, by their community, because they are considered to have had power and been empowered and therefore taken to task for the consequences of white justice or injustice, as the case may be. So not always is empowerment a good thing.
So it may be better to use the term a shared responsibility. That's another one that we tried with Rebecca. But I think justification is our main approach, right? You need to be able to bring in and defend your choices. But yeah, you're right. You know, we talk mostly about co-power for situations like military or religious interpreting, when you have this co-construction role, right? Or like approach, co-construction, that you really have to be.
No, but if you come in with your own personal opinions and you shout them from the rooftops, you have lost credibility from many of your participants.
But I don't think we refer to the personal opinion. I think we refer to how much you care, how much you are involved in the outcome of this particular interpreting event. You know, how much you align your participation with what both parties are hoping to accomplish with this. So the goal of the interpreting encounter now.
Yeah, no, I've been learning from these Aboriginal encounters, which is a very, very rigid, complete cultural confrontation. And unfortunately, the result is that nobody wants to be an interpreter anymore. It's too risky for them. So there's more things in the world than we are really contemplating in our classes. So.
Yeah, I think it might be relevant. The same thing for the Cherokees and Navajo indigenous people in the U.S. They come as advocates, but then with their own interpreters. But you're right, then they pay all the consequences of being the interpreters. So yeah. All right. We would like to spend more time with you, Anthony, but it's time for us. So thank you very much for coming and joining us. And we are so grateful for your time and so late at night. And we hope to see you soon at conferences or in other places. Thank you.
Great to see you again, Ola. Many thanks for the questions. My apologies for the questions I didn't answer correctly. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So we are going to have a break right now, and at 10:15 we'll come back in parallel sessions. Session 1, Agency, Politics and Diplomacy, and Session 2, Language, Industry and Academia. Thank you very much for this very fruitful and opening new horizons and new ideas and new concepts, as always, by Professor Anthony Pym. And we are going to see you soon, today and tomorrow. And thank you very much for participating in our keynote speech today. So 10:15, we're coming back in parallel sessions. Bye-bye. Thank you.